Through the kindness of our donors, the National Catholic Broadcasting Council presents Let Us Reflect Together. The Promises of Advent. Fourth week of Advent, the promise is magnified. The Magnificat, with Father Peter Tirone, lifting up the lowly. Mary rejoices that God's power humbles the proud and exalts the lowly. He has shown strength with his arm. He has scattered the proud in the thoughts of their hearts. He has brought down the powerful from their thrones and lifted up the lowly.
While waiting in the line at the grocery store in 2015, I was surprised to see an image of the Blessed Virgin Mary on the cover of National Geographic magazine. Even more striking was the title, "The Virgin Mary is the most powerful woman in the world." It was reassuring to see a secular publication acknowledge her historical existence and use the title by which Christians have always honored her. What was surprising, however, was that they chose to highlight power as one of Mary's attributes. In our present-day society, the word power has many meanings. The Oxford Dictionary defines it as the capacity or ability to direct or influence the behavior of others or the course of events. When we are asked to picture a powerful woman, what image comes to mind? What qualities do we think of first? In the second verse of the hymn, "My Soul Magnifies the Lord," Mary praises God for coming to the aid of the lowly. For he has shown great power with his arm and has scattered the proud. He has brought down rulers from their thrones and lifted up the lowly. In our world, power is often misused. Those who hold it may exploit influence for personal gain. This was true in Mary's time, and it remains true today. Politicians may cling to authority rather than serve their people. Social media influencers may seek notoriety through sensationalism and detraction. In workplaces or schools, bullies use intimidation to feed their egos. Abuses of power are common, and the result is a world lacking peace, where the arrogant use fear to control and ignore humility in leadership. If power is the ability to influence people or events, then we find a stark contrast between Mary's example and the misuse we so often see. Was National Geographic wrong to call her powerful? Not at all. Mary, Queen of Heaven and Earth, is indeed most powerful, but her power comes from God, a truth she makes clear in her Magnificat. Dr. Carrie Gress, a Catholic philosopher and mother, has extensively written on how modern ideologies distort true femininity. She notes that movements promising women respect and freedom often fail by promoting self-absorption and rejecting God's plan. Mary shows us another way. Authentic Christian power is rooted in self-giving love of God and neighbor. It is lived in purity, humility, and kindness. These virtues influence others not through control, but by drawing them to Christ for healing, conversion, and transformation. In one reported apparition, a seer asked Our Lady why she was so beautiful. She replied, "Because I love much." Mary reveals that her beauty and power are not in dominance, but in love. May Mary teach us to use whatever influence we hold not for self-interest, but for the flourishing of others. Through her example, may we learn to magnify the Lord, guiding those around us to experience His mercy and love.
Join us tomorrow for Filled with Good Things with Father Peter Tirone.